So just as a reminder, this is the last kind of new content lecture. So we're going to talk about these principles of market-based environmental policy. So about like Coase and Pigou. And then Thursday is no class because there's a holiday, and happy Thanksgiving for that. And then the next lecture period will be a review lecture. And so I don't have any specific thing prepared, but I am happy to take your questions. There's some review material online for the final exam that, if you might have questions about, like how do we get this answer or that answer, or just general questions about how do we solve for this or that. Be happy to take those questions just like we did on the midterm. I guess I might note that that at the top of every unit, there is a study guide, which is basically these are learning outcomes, which are in, as I designed the content for the thing, these are the things that I had in mind that I wanted to make sure that you knew coming out of each one of the units. And so that also doubles as saying like, so those are the things I'm expecting you to know. Those are the things I'm going to assess you over. And so that kind of provides you a framework as to figure out, where you might need to study and where you might already be okay. And then after next Tuesday's lecture, then Thursday is the default stage one of the final exam. So that will be, you have basically Thursday at midnight, early Thursday morning, you'll get 24, so Wednesday night is what I mean by Thursday at midnight. So you get all day Thursday to get, so you can start the exam, and then you'll get 90 minutes, just like in the midterm, and you'll have to do the respond to lockdown browser. You'll end up getting some score on the exam, and that will be 80% of your final exam score. Then Friday, again in the default case, then the exam opens up again in a slightly different assignment, and that'll be the stage 2 exam. And in that case, you don't have to use lockdown browser. You can collaborate with others taking the exam, and you can use your notes. And so you can't use Chegg or Course Hero or anything else, but you can use your textbook, you can use your notes, you can use others who are currently in the class. And you can work together seeing exactly the same problems you saw the Thursday before. And so you can make kind of, corrections or whatever you might view them. And then that exam will be 20% of your final exam score. So your total exam score will just be 80% the first and 20% the second. Now, if you've got a really tight schedule that week with lots of other exams, so you don't want to take things Thursday, Friday, you can go on to Canvas and you can click on the people in Canvas, and then under the people in Canvas there, then let's switch there. Under the people in Canvas, then you can then find a groups tab, and then under the groups tab, you should see a couple of groups. One of them says early exam group, the other one says later exam group. And if you'd rather to be in the later exam group, then you can just say join, and then that'll do that, and do that before December 1st. And then if you do that, then what that'll do is I will then end up giving you an exam that its availability opens up Monday for stage 1, and then stage 2 will open up Tuesday of the normal exam week. So, so these are kind of bracketing that weekend. And so, by default, everyone's currently scheduled for Thursday, Friday. If you'd prefer to do Monday, Tuesday, you're not going to have access to the answers from the Thursday, Friday group, but you'll have a couple extra days just that weekend there, and then hopefully that provides you some scheduling flexibility to deal with all the other exams that you'll be taking that week. The other note that I'll mention is that course evaluations are available. If you go to Canvas, in the top left, there's a little course evaluations link, or in the course information module, you can find a link to that, and you can feel free to give your evaluation of this course and I think all your other university courses too. So there is a question, does the second exam have a time limit? Great question. I'm sorry that I didn't make that more explicit. The stage 2 exam, you get 24 hours and there's no time limit. You can go in and you can say, at 8 a.m. you can say, I really had a problem with problem 5. And so, and Adina said that she didn't have, that she thought she understood that one. So I'm going to make a time to talk to her about problem 5. But then, maybe you'd say, well, problem 10, well, Chloe said that she knew about problem 10. And so, but she's only available to chat with me at 2 p.m. And so then at 2 p.m., I'll talk to her about that. So basically you've got all of Friday to end up submitting your stage 2. It's like 24 hours. There's no 90-minute time limit. You just, whenever you want to work on it, you can work on it on Friday as needed. And then you can go back and change previous answers from that as well. So, you can see the whole exam, and I think I'll have it set so that even if you submit it, you can then go back and submit a new one, so long as you do it before the availability goes away. And so we'll keep the one with the highest score. So it'll be your or no, we'll keep the latest, I'm sorry, not the one with the highest score. We'll keep, if you happen to hit submit a few times, the grade that'll be kept will be the most recent one, the latest grade. And so you can even feel free to say, I did all of it, by 11 a.m. on Friday, and then you find out at noon when you're chatting with some of your colleagues here, then you find out that actually maybe I didn't do problem 7 the way I should have. Then you can go back and redo problem 7 and resubmit a new submission and so on. So that's how it's going to be laid out. So did that answer the questions? Are there any other questions about that? Okay, great. All right, so I see another question. We'll be able to see the score of the first exam before we take the second one. I think so. I'm going to try turning on a live transcript here. So I think that so the way I hope that it's designed, that I can tweak Canvas to do this, is that after you do your Thursday, then you'll get your score for that, but you will not see which questions you got right or wrong. Because that ends up kind of, if all of you get everything together and you all know what you got right, what you got wrong, you can effectively build your own solution set. So that said, I guess if I give you your scores Thursday, if one of you got everything right, then, then that kind of does the same thing. So right now, I am probably going to make you able to see your score immediately after you take the exam, but you definitely won't be able to see your individual per question scores. I might renege on that a little bit, just because I might not want to accidentally leak a solution set by leaking someone who got a really good score. So I might take that back, but at the moment, I think the way Canvas is designed by default, you'll see your score, but you won't see the per question scores. Later in the middle of finals week, after everyone has taken the final, I'll release the per question scores. But at least initially, the best you're going to get is your score. Keep in mind, everybody needs to take both stages, because if you don't take stage 2, the stage 2 score will be 0, and the highest you can get on your whole final exam will be 80%. So it's like the first 80% are stage 1 and the second 20% is stage 2. You really should attempt both if you want to attempt the whole 100%. Now, if you feel like you get 100% on stage 1 and you're okay with an 80% on your final exam total, then I guess you can just skip stage 2. That's certainly an option that's available to you. So any other questions? And so I'm hoping this 2-stage exam isn't more work for you. I'm hoping it'll end up being a way for you to have a little less anxiety, but doesn't, I didn't want to give a whole second exam like a retake, like originally was planned, because we didn't have the time during finals week. So it's my compromise to give you something that hopefully takes away some anxiety, giving you a way to resurrect points that you felt like you lost in the first go around, and work together. And hopefully the process of collaboration will also be formative and help you learn new things as you explain things to each other. All right, so in that case, let's flip. By the way, so I turned on this live transcription. I meant to do this, but I always forget to do that. So you notice these words that are coming up there. You should be able to click on them and move them around the screen if they are in your way. And I think there's even a way to turn them off from your end. So if you don't like the live transcript, then feel free to get rid of it or move it away. In the times that it's been turned on for me, I found it to be very effective, and I could push it off to the side when I didn't need it, but then consult it when I did. So if you have any feelings about this live transcript thing, let me know. But if by default I could turn it on automatically, I probably would, just for accessibility reasons. All right, so let me flip over to sharing screen. Let's go kill this share. Okay. So hopefully you see my screen there, and that little transcript is underneath it. You can drag it to above it as well. And I think there is some way that you, from your end, can, if you click on the live transcript, which is kind of down at the very bottom, along with mute, stop video, etc. If you click the little up arrow there, I think you can say hide subtitle if you want to get rid of that. All right, so moving into a new unit now, and I don't have a whole lot of time to cover things from this unit. It's really just meant to kind of give you a hint of these market-based solutions to environmental policy. And there you can imagine there's kind of two philosophies here. There's there's the what do you get without government? So without government, and then there's the with government solutions. And the without government, this is kind of like a hypothetical case, because it turns out that as I hope we've motivated, if we just let everybody do their own thing without a third party or an institution that kind of we all agree to be a part of, and that institution makes rules to help allocate things more fairly, then what ends up happening is we get solutions which are not necessarily we end up with things like market failures, for example. So people do not consider all the costs and benefits, and then so we're probably going to have the need for some type of government or institutional involvement. But this guy named Coase, I think he's from the London School, challenged that idea. And he said, well, maybe there actually is a way to correct for these damages that are caused by production without government getting involved in taxing or regulating in any particular way. And so Coase said, property rights are super important, or are super powerful. And so Coase's thought was that maybe property rights are enough. And so if government were to get involved, they just have to get involved to help enforce that this property is owned by this person and they govern everything that goes on in that property. And if anyone else wants access to that property, then they need to go through the owner of that property. So if government is involved, they're just there to aid in the in maintenance of ownership and maintenance of property rights. And in many cases, government might not even need to be involved in that. For example, if you put a fence around your property, then you control access to that property even without government getting involved. Someone could break in, because they could come through your fence, but then you might be able to take action against them. You know, you can chase them away, you can pursue other things. Maybe that's when you call the police. And so the police are there to keep them outside of your fenced area. The police aren't there to decide who gets to pollute and all those sorts of things. The police are just there to help, you know, to make your fence even stronger. And so Coase's idea is that maybe property rights are enough, and he formed the Coase theorem, which states, and it doesn't really state something which immediately makes a lot of sense, and so I will unpack this, but at least as the Coase theorem as it's written normally states that the allocation of property rights has no bearing on how economic resources are used. So this is a very subtle statement, but what he is saying here is that under this theory, it doesn't matter who owns the air, for example. So by owns the air, who has exclusive access over choosing how the air is used? A company that pollutes could own the air. And in that case, they would be free to pollute it without anyone, without having to worry about any sort of action being taken against them. Or people of a city could own the air above them. And it doesn't actually matter whether we allocate the air to the polluters or to the city. In the end, the allocation of abatement, pollution abatement, the amount of pollution abatement you get will be the same. Now that doesn't make a whole lot of sense until you kind of like have to think it sort of through. And so his basic insight was that you can have bargaining, so Coasean bargaining between parties. Well, and so what Coasean bargaining will do is they're saying that, let's say that a company that pollutes feels like they have no constraints and they can just pollute into the air as much as they want. Now, if you live in an adjacent city and you start feeling the effects of that pollution, those negative effects, that negative externality, then what you can do is you can bargain with that company to stop polluting. So we could imagine that a town might pay a company to stop polluting. And so basically the polluters, they don't want to pollute, but they're just polluting because that's how they make their goods. If they were to stop polluting, they're going to stop making goods, and that's going to prevent them from making money. So a town could go to the polluters and say, we recognize it's going to cost you $1 million to bring pollution levels down to a point where we can breathe. What we've done is we've raised $1 million, and we are going to pay you the $1 million to pay you to stop making some of your goods to bring your pollution down. We understand you need to make something. We understand that you would prefer to make a certain revenue target at the end of the year. We are going to relieve that revenue target for you by paying you the $1 million that we have collected ourselves, and we will pay that to you, and then you will pollute less. That is one option. Now, the other option is that the town could actually own the air. So this here is the option where the company owns the air. The other option is the town owns the air. And so if the town owns the air, if they have a way to prevent the polluter from entering their air, from accessing their air, and you can say, well, how might they do that? Well, that's where policing might come into play, or some other creative solutions. But if there's some way to enforce that the town owns the air, then now the company has to bargain with the town in order to make any of their goods. So in this case, the company might pay the town to allow for pollution. And so that would be a way the company manages to get goods out there. They can say, all right, we recognize that every good that we produces some pollution. We recognize that puts a cost on you. How much do you want in order for us to be able to actually produce goods? And the town can come back and say, well, we know that we need a certain air quality standard, and so we are going to charge you. And we know that every good reduces the air quality, and so we are going to charge you a certain amount that ensures that you're never going to cross this air quality standard that we have set for ourselves. And so you can bargain both ways. It doesn't matter who owns the air. Either way, the final economic resource allocation, like, how the air is being allocated, how the pollution abatement is being allocated is going to be the same. Now, it may be the case that in one of these, there might be a larger cost being paid by one group, than the other. So we might view one of these as fairer than the other. But from an economic point of view, at least at this point, just from raw economics, we don't care about how fair one is over the other. We just care that without government intervention, what would automatically happen just based on bargaining. And Coase was saying that it actually doesn't matter as long as there are property rights, as long as somebody owns the resource, then everything's going to work out without government even coming in there. That's the Coase theorem. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick question. I'm wondering about the coercion bargaining. Which one's the most common? When the company owns the air, or when the town owns the air? Which one's like the most common?
Well, there's not because it's going to vary from it. It really has to do with how easy it is to establish ownership. And so,
Okay.
for if it's like grazing, like you don't want certain animals grazing on your land. Well, it's easy for you to put up a fence around your land, and that'll prevent grazing. And if somebody else, like with their free range cattle, would want access to your land, then they'll come knocking on your door and they'll say, could you open up your land, or at least a little bit of your land, allow my cattle to graze on it? Then in that case, you own the land, and that's that. But it could be the other way around, where let's say I fish in a stream, and but upstream from me, there's a company, and that stream, and that company dumps in to that stream. Well, so in that case, the company can dump into the stream, and I can't control their access to the stream. So effectively, they own the stream. So my only choice is to walk up to the company and say, here's $1,000. Can you not dump this month? And then do that every single month. And so it kind of depends on how easy it is to establish property rights.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so that's the basic idea. Are there other questions about Coasean bargaining, or about this Coase theorem? Okay. So it's like property rights being taken, to the extreme, and assuming they're going to solve all the world's problems. But the major problem with property rights, as the book talks about, is that they assume Coase assumes that transaction costs are negligible. And okay, there's a great question here. So what happens if they do not agree to not pollute and take the money, but don't follow through? So, so that's a great question. So the question here is, I go up to the polluter, I say, here's $1,000, don't pollute this month. They say, okay, but then they keep polluting. That is where Coase says we need the government, because the government needs to be there to help enforce these agreements. If I have made an agreement with someone, a bargain, I need government there, or police or whoever, to be able to say, hey, you signed a contract here. Then the government is there going to be there to say that we are going to enforce this contract. So that's, Coase is okay with some government or some institutional involvement, but that institutional involvement is just there to enforce property rights. And so when you spend $1,000, you're effectively buying some property rights, at least for that month. You're kind of saying that for this month, you don't have full access to that property. If they don't follow through, then you know, in the Wild West, I guess you could go and burn down the company or something like that. So that's how you could make it stick. You'd say, hey, I don't want you to pollute, but I get why you're polluting. I'll pay you $1,000, so don't pollute. And if you don't pollute, then maybe in the Wild West, you could say, all right, fine, I'm just gonna attack your factory. Now, in modern times, Coase would say, well, we don't have to all, like, you know, resort to violence. We actually do have a government, a police, we've got lawyers. So we could then take this contract to the court and say, you are in violation, or you're in breach of the contract. And so now that you're in breach, now there's damages that may have to be done. But as long as there's the threat of the government getting involved, the government doesn't actually have to get involved. Does that make sense? Okay. So this whole thing is all depends on these so-called transaction costs being negligible. So what do we mean by transactions costs being negligible? Well, imagine that a town wishes to pool money to pay a polluter to stop polluting. Sounds great in theory, but in reality, what's going to happen is it's going to be really difficult to go around to every single person and to get them to agree to pay into a pool. There's going to be a major free rider effect. So where there's going to be a bunch of people that will benefit from this that don't need to pay in to receive the benefits. So it's generally going to be difficult to get everyone in agreement that action needs to happen and to get them all to agree to pay in to a sufficient amount to make it happen. So there is a transaction cost. It is not easy to organize all of these people. So there's the cost of organization of a large group. That's one example of a transaction cost. There could be plenty of other examples. Maybe you need to actually, maybe in your contract, you've agreed to a particular pollution level. Well, then now somebody's got to be responsible for measuring to see if you're in agreement or in breach of contract. And so now, you know, the pollution company doesn't actually think that you're going to hire somebody that actually is able to measure. And so they can cheat a little bit on that. And so to prevent them from cheating, you're going to have to raise even more money to pay people to come to measure these levels. So assuming that all this bargaining can just happen for free is kind of naive, right? So transaction costs are very real. Are usually not negligible. And by the way, Coasean bargaining does happen in the real world. I work on a research project where we talk about watershed management, and we work in with large companies, have interactions with farmers that affect the quality of water available for use for these large companies. And the companies are regularly paying farmers to change their land use patterns. And so this really is an example of Coasean bargaining today. And in those cases, the transaction costs are relatively minor because there's a small number of entities involved. So it's realistic with a small number of stakeholders. So you can imagine maybe one firm and one farmer, for example. But it is unrealistic as you get to large numbers of people that you have to coordinate into some sort of transient firm just for the sake of this interaction, and then they kind of disintegrate after that. So Coase theorem ends up not being super practical, but it provides vision, really. So that's the big thing here, is that this is provides a vision of efficiency without government. And by looking at where Coasean bargaining fails, it inspires us to come up with new solutions that are like Coasean bargaining, but don't have all of the problems. And so it allows, it sort of inspires less obtrusive forms of government intervention. I'll say government market intervention. So the book talks a little bit about this, how the Coasean system would work in a hypothetical world, but not in the real world. But it's still useful to think about that hypothetical world. And so, I'm sorry, I had a prospectus defense early this morning, and then another class. And I think the extra talking from during the defense has just killed me for some reason today. So so we're going to leave Coase in the back of our mind for a second, in order for us to come up with a way in which we can kind of use it to inspire something that provides a little bit of government intervention, but in a smart way that still provides for a huge amount of freedom. So before we get there, we can imagine how else could government get involved. And the book talks about, these ways. And, we could have, prescriptive regulation. And this is the type of thing you'd expect in a command and control system. Something more like a China, for example, where you, in prescriptive regulation, you can take it to the extreme where every government sort of specifically says, this company does exactly this company does exactly this. So you've got one decision maker deciding what everyone's doing, and there's no room for the market to go into play there. And sort of the basics of command and control, like the kind of the smaller scale version of that, the book talks about things like technology standards. So in a technology standard, you say specifically that regardless of how bad your company is, regardless of what the damages your company is causing to the world by making your good, we are going to ask all of you to abide by a particular technology standard. You all have to use dolphin-safe fishing nets, for example, or you all have to use a particular brand of scrubber on your stacks, and so on and so forth. And so you come up and you say, everyone has to use this technology. There's no rational reason for it, aside from everyone knowing that this is the sort of maybe the best technology, or at least much better than the technologies currently being in use. So you're forcing everyone to use a particular technology. The other idea is a performance standard. Where instead you say, we don't exactly care how much or what technologies you use, but we have to make sure that you don't pollute any more than this. And so it allows across the board, it's making everyone perform to a certain level. So, we see these sorts of things like, California has emission standards for vehicles that end up trickling across the rest of the United States. And so you have to meet certain emission standards on these vehicles, regardless of how well all of the vehicles as a collective are doing together. Everyone has to meet particular performance standards, and someone at the government level decides on what those performance standards are. And then, of course, you can have some mix of those. So you can have a hybrid approach. And these are kind of the most intrusive ways to attempt to complete incomplete markets. So in other words, these companies are putting some damage into the world that they are not paying the cost of. And so rather than taking a pure market-based approach and forcing them to pay the cost of whatever damages that they're putting in there, you just say, all right, everyone, we're going to try to remove their damages entirely. And this is going to be much more costly for some than others. It'll be much more needed for some than others, but we don't really care about the individual situation. And we also don't care about how it relates to the global situation. We just sort of say arbitrarily that everyone must meet this particular standard. So it's a very large role of the government to take control away from the market, and it is a totally kind of centralized, so this here is a centralized control of production. So that is one way the government could get involved. Another way the government could get involved are information-based approaches. And so these, because they're information-based, these attack information asymmetry. So we know that in order for markets to be efficient, they need to be competitive, they need to be complete, and they need to have symmetric information. And so rather than attacking the completeness, which is what kind of the other one does, then these information-based approaches that try to attack the information symmetry. And so they talked about several of these in the book, and I'm not going to go into great detail here, but you can put, for example, right-to-know laws into account. And so these are mandatory. And so in the right-to-know case, you're saying that polluters have to disclose how much they polluted. And somewhere on a government website somewhere, you could look up for every single polluter, how much did they pollute? And so that provides you information that was known by the producer, but not normally by the consumer, so that you as a consumer, now that you know that information, then that helps you better make decisions. And so you might know that, you might think that plastic is very recyclable, but when you actually look at the numbers of how much plastic is actually being recycled, it totally changes your mind and you stop, using as much plastic because you have that information. You might think that a particular product you buy doesn't lead to a lot of pollution, but when you actually go to this website, you find that wow, this tiny little component that is used in this big product I totally forgot about in order to make that tiny little component, it generates a lot of pollution. And so me buying this product is effectively generating lots of pollution. And so by bringing symmetry to, informational symmetry to the market, then maybe you make better decisions. The alternative way to do that is to do eco-labeling and certification. And this is voluntary. And so in this case, you're not telling everyone that they have to disclose the damages that they produce, but you're telling some of them that if you want to apply for this label, we will certify that you meet the constraints that are associated with this label so that you can legally put this label on your product. So dolphin safe tuna, for example. So you don't necessarily say that everyone has to use a dolphin safe net, but everyone who uses a dolphin safe net gets to put a little label on their tuna so that when consumers are buying tuna, they can decide on their own if this matters to them, that they can then choose the ones that only use that have the certified dolphin safe label on them, or certified organic. That might be another one of those. So eco-labeling is in some ways it's less obtrusive because you volunteer to get the label, but in theory, those with the label will have a competitive advantage over those that don't have the label. So it provides incentive for those to want to get the label. So that is a different, an alternative of what you could do as a government. Now, neither of these are market-based solutions. So how could we possibly use the government in a much more market-based way, where instead of us saying that everyone has to meet this, we can say some of you can meet this, some of you don't have to. It's really going to be based on how well the market's doing as a whole. And so, not everyone has to meet the same pollution abatement standards because not everyone is as big of a polluter, or or some people have deeper pockets than others. And so, how do we account for these natural asymmetries in the marketplace? And so that's kind of what I want to close things out with here. So this is kind of the important thing and how it compares to Coasean bargaining. That's kind of what we're talking about here, these truly market-based approaches. So true market-based approaches. And then I'll say and Pigou. All right, so in a market, by the way, before I get to that, are there questions there about the eco-labeling or about any of these, about the prescriptive regulation or the information-based approaches? Are there any questions about this?
Eco-labeling can be used on any product. Basically, for example, when you're shopping in a grocery store, you see like a green tag on it saying how it's eco-friendly, or like something like that's like an example. Any fruit product, any house appliance item. Okay.
Exactly. Yep. Any label that you can't get for free. So of course, anybody can write something. They can say like, we're made with the best ingredients. And you say, well, what are the best ingredients? But if it's a recognized label that says, certified organic, now it's whether you trust whatever the heck certified organic means. That's another question. But a third party decided what certified organic means, and they decided to certify this company to that organic standard. And so that if it's got that label, it would be a fraud for it to put that label, and they would be liable to be sued by putting that label. So they could be sued by the organization that certifies them as organic if they put that label on without actually getting certified.
Okay.
Anybody could do that. Yeah, USDA yeah, exactly. So there's a good question a good point in the chat that there are these standards, like, the USDA might have a standard for that. And so the government might be the organization doing the certification, or a third party could be doing the certification, but then through the legal system helps ensure that their certification is a good one. So either you're getting a government stamp or you're getting a third-party stamp, and that third-party stamp is copyrighted and trademarked. And so if anyone were to put that stamp on their food without being licensed to put that food on their food, then they could get sued by that third party. So that's the two ways you could do that. All right, any other questions about that? Okay, so when we're thinking about markets, what we've got, so the issue with markets, well, sorry, when we think about markets, I guess I should draw our diagram here. So we've got some quantity, and let's have this be a quantity of, let's say, pollution abatement. Now, pollution abatement, we know pollution abatement has a marginal damage curve. It has a marginal abatement cost. And so it has a cost to the private, it has a cost to the producers, and it also has a cost to all the rest of us that lived in a world that's full of this pollution. So, so there's, if I'm focusing just on abatement, then the cost that I'm plotting here is, this is the marginal abatement cost. Or the MAC, as sometimes it's called. And this is the cost to the producer for doing any abatement. So, this is our producer cost of abatement. And so in the unregulated case, well, so here's the thing. Pollution abatement is a public good. Which means that it provides a benefit. But as with many public goods, although it provides a benefit, no one's willing to pay for it. So no one is willing to pay despite the benefit. I love my clean air, but if you ask me to pay for the clean air, my question is going to be, is she paying for clean air? And if she's not paying for clean air, then I'm not going to pay for clean air. So even though I love my clean air, apparently someone out there is paying for clean air, and that's apparently enough because I'm happy with the clean air as it is, so I'm not going to pay for it. So we all experience a benefit, but we don't necessarily pay the cost of that benefit. So in a market, a market comes to equilibrium where the marginal cost to the supplier meets the marginal benefit to the consumer. Well, the consumer of this pollution abatement, the public, they're not willing to pay for it. So the marginal benefit curve is effectively flat and zero. So this down here is the effective marginal benefit curve. Felt by consumers, the public. And if this down here is our marginal benefit curve, and this is our marginal cost curve, so I can just write that maybe. This is our marginal cost. This down here, this flat line here is our marginal benefit. Then the market equilibrium is right here. So that there is the market equilibrium level of pollution abatement. Pollution pollution abatement costs. In order to eliminate pollution, somebody's got to pay for it. If nobody's willing to pay for it, you will have no pollution abatement. And so you end up getting that equilibrium down here. A market-based approach to ensuring pollution abatement reaches a healthy level is to try to put in a demand curve that companies feel that forces them to operate as if the rest of the public were paying for that abatement. So effectively, there is a social marginal benefit, which maybe I'll draw up here. And this here is the social marginal benefit and that represents how much we all actually care about our clean air. And if we were willing to pay for it, then the companies would come to equilibrium right here. So this here is the efficient level of abatement. Down here, I could call this Q star. And this here is the efficient price. So this is down here, this is we all, so P market is equal to 0. We're not willing to pay. And because of that, Q market is equal to 0. They're not willing to supply. But if there was a way for us to be willing to pay, or at least for the producers to feel the benefit that we actually feel as a society, then there would be a price that would be paid to the consumers that would force them to produce some abatement. And we would end up getting, as before, producer surplus and consumer surplus. So we'd end up getting a consumer surplus, I'm sorry, a producer surplus down here, and a consumer surplus here. If only we could agree on a price that we were willing to pay. And so effectively what government's role is here is to fill in the missing demand curve. That's really what government is trying to do. So, so we need an approach that government is to fill in the missing demand curve. So how do we do that? There are two ways that we can do that. And so if I were to redraw this market graph again, and so I'll call this abatement, again, Q, and this here is dollars per ton of abatement. We've got our marginal abatement cost. MAC or just MC if you prefer. And we have our social marginal benefit curve. Social marginal benefit, so SMB. And so what government could potentially do is somehow create So remember, the marginal benefit curve is not necessarily a demand curve. We are going to fill in the missing demand curve, and we can either fill in a perfectly inelastic or perfectly elastic demand curve. And so the idea here is that at this level here, which I'll call T star, I can imagine, what if I had a perfectly elastic demand, or at this level here, which I'll call Q star, I think the book might call X star, we have a perfectly inelastic demand. If I could impose a demand curve on the market that was either perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic, but it intersected the marginal abatement cost at exactly this magic point right here in the middle, then the markets would respond to that demand curve by shifting their level of abatement up to the socially efficient level of abatement. So this down here is QM is equal to 0, and this here is the socially efficient. And the way in which I do that is by either imposing this is a tax approach, and then down here, the inelastic case is it's a cap. We'll view this as a cap approach. So an allowance approach. Maybe I'll say that, an allowance approach. So the tax approach here is you tax every unit of pollution. And then the allowance approach is you issue allowances to pollute so that total is equal to basically Q star. So total is equal to the total amount that you want the entire industry to pollute. These are our two approaches. So let's sort of jump in to the how do we determine the right taxes for these things.
Professor, could you go back for a second and catch I didn't catch the allowance approach.
Yeah.
Can you have one of the, are you able to have only one or the other, or can you have both at the same time for the approaches?
Well, they are effectively equivalent approaches, and so doing one, you can't kind of do both, because there's a risk that you'd end up, like, every allowance you choose effectively generates an equivalent tax, and every tax you use effectively generates an equivalent allowance. So they are just two ways to do the same thing, and so you can't. It's kind of like a waterbed or something like that. As long as you push down on one, you get it. So you got to choose your lever, or choose where you're going to grab the lever, and you're either choosing it from the tax approach or choosing it from the allowance approach, but they're both doing the same thing.
Okay.
All right, I'm good. All right. So the way in which we do this is, if I stop thinking about, so let's not worry about abatement so much as, now we can go back to thinking about the goods that producers are actually producing and the marginal damages that they're doing by producing those goods. And so if I draw that market diagram, this is Q, which is goods, just generic goods that are being produced. And this is dollars per good. And so I know that there is going to be a demand for the good, which maybe looks like this. So this isn't a demand for pollution abatement. This is demand for the good itself. So this is our marginal benefit, which is equal to demand for the good itself. Then we're going to have some private marginal cost. So the marginal cost of production. And so I'll draw that maybe here. So that's our private marginal cost. And then we've got our marginal damages, which I'll draw down here. Let's say they look like this. Oh. And then with those two together, we will do like we did, I think, before the midterm, add the two of them together to get our social marginal cost. And so the social marginal cost will end up looking like, say, this curve. So I've just added those two curves together. And then that generates a market equilibrium, a normal market equilibrium right here. So I'll say this is our market equilibrium. And then we've got our efficient solution. And then, oh, I'm sorry, and Chloe asked in the chat, so basically the focus is either on taxes or the amount of pollution. Yes, that's what we're trying to say is either fix the pollution or fix the tax. And we're seeing how to do that here. And so, and then this up here is our efficient solution that we would like to get to. And so as we've learned, we know that this area inside here is the deadweight loss. That's not very readable. And we'd like to avoid that deadweight loss by shifting us from the market solution. So I guess I can write that down here, the market equilibrium here. We'd like to shift that down to the efficient one here. And we effectively then want to shift the price of the good from the market price to the socially efficient price, where that extra price is what is accounting for the marginal damages that are being done. It's accounting for the negative externality. And so what you end up, the Pigouvian tax, and so I drew this out of scale, and I apologize for that. But if I were to go down here, and I were to look at this distance here, this distance, if I were to draw these properly with like an actual graphing program, these two distances are the same. So this here is the marginal damage at the socially efficient equilibrium. And that happens to also be identical to this distance up here, because I just added these two curves on top of each other. That is your tax. So if you want to take a tax perspective, if you are able to estimate these, and by the way, there is a Nobel Prize winning work of somebody who died pretty recently that actually can pretty well estimate these marginal damages, allowing you to calculate this quantity. And so this T star, which is your Pigouvian tax, is equal to the marginal damage function evaluated at the socially efficient equilibrium. And so, you have to keep in mind, this is in dollars per good. And so basically this tax approach is if you can find this, marginal damage curve and evaluate it at the right price, then you can basically say anybody who wants to enter this market, that's fine, but we are going to charge you this particular tax, this emissions tax. So you can view this as like an emissions tax. And most taxes we refer to as distortionary because they shift you away from the socially efficient solution. But this is a tax that is known to be corrective. And it's corrective because it moves you, because it eliminates deadweight loss. Taxes that create deadweight loss are distortionary, but this particular tax eliminates deadweight loss. It gets rid of it. And on top of that, this particular tax, in theory, has the so-called double dividend hypothesis applies. So the double dividend and the idea here is that this tax generates revenue that can reduce distortionary taxes. So the idea is that every paycheck you get income tax taken out of it, and that income tax that is taken out prevents you from using the amount of money that you had, and so you consume less. And so that ends up being a distortionary task. It generates deadweight loss because you're going to end up consuming less than the socially efficient equilibrium. So you end up not being able to spend that money and putting it in producers' hands. Putting that money in a producer's hands will not only benefit the producer by getting the money, but also you, because you bought the thing that the producer produced, but the government took it away from you. And so we view that as a distortionary tax. What a Pigouvian tax does is it not only gets rid of the negative externalities of pollution, but the revenue that's generated by the Pigouvian tax means that income taxes might be able to be reduced. So you not only reduce deadweight loss from getting rid of the negative externality, but you reduce deadweight loss by reducing other distortionary taxes as well. And that's the so-called double dividend hypothesis.
So just making sure by definition, so this distortionary taxes generate deadweight loss while
that's right.
runs limited. Okay, just making sure for the definitions.
That's right. A traditional microeconomics course, you're going to have some old school economist standing in front of you telling you that taxes are bad, and they will draw a market diagram and they will show that taxes increase a price higher than it should be, and that's going to generate deadweight loss. We are saying that the price is actually too low, so our tax is increasing it to where it should be to get rid of the negative externality. And by the way, the revenue that's generated is revenue the government can use on other things. And that means that they can reduce their use of other taxes that are kind of the more classical distortionary taxes. That's how a Pigouvian tax works. Now, the other thing that I want to mention here is that this Q star can be viewed as a maximum amount well, this can be tied. So I guess I could say that you can view the marginal, you can view the pollution emitted at Q star as a max allowance for pollution in this industry. And so in the last couple minutes I have here, that then sets up the opportunity to do an alternative to taxing, is allowance trading, or so-called cap and trade. And the idea here is that the government will sell or issue, so the government issues allowances to polluters so that total pollution is under the critical level. So that's the cap part. And then the trade is that producers sell unused allowances to other producers. So this alternative to taxing, and so this is the trade. And I guess I should say here that the equilibrium price on allowances is basically directly related to the tax on marginal damages. So this market, by fixing the amount of pollution to the same amount of pollution that we would have gotten if we would have done a tax, what will end up happening is these allowances will get traded and their prices will go up and down based on how many allowances are available to be traded. And in the end, you end up putting the same cost on polluters that you would by doing a tax. But the potentially nice thing about this this cap and trade is it puts a more direct encouragement on some pollution producers to reduce their pollution even further, because it provides them an opportunity to sell their unused. So in the tax case, of course, there's the least amount of, in the tax case, any amount of pollution that you don't emit means you pay less taxes, and that's great. That is it looks good on the balance sheet. But what cap and trade does is it kind of encourages everyone to start investing in technologies that allow them to not only be the producer of the product that they produce primarily, but they also become producers of allowances that are unused, that allow them to sell them to other people that do need those, that maybe can't afford or just simply can't make their processes any more efficient. So this general idea of taxing or cap and trade is an idea that it allows you to have some people that still pollute a lot and some people that pollute a little. And so it kind of allows the allocation of pollution allowances to move around to those that need it the most. And so it in itself is a more equitable way to allocate pollution controls than to just uniformly say everyone must meet a particular technology or a particular performance level. And there's a lot more that I could say about that, but I have sadly run out of time. But I wanted to at least get you to the point where you were introduced to the idea of cap and trade and how it relates, at least to some point, to these Pigouvian taxes and this general idea of the double dividend hypothesis with Pigouvian taxes. And that's where I'll stop now, and I won't ask you questions on the exam that go any further than that. Your book goes into a little bit more depth than that, and I encourage you taking a look at that. So for now, let me do a attendance question. I meant to do one of these earlier as well. And so the attendance question here is, what do we call, what is the name of the idea that a Pigouvian tax reduces deadweight loss in two different ways simultaneously. There's a name for that, hypothesis. So that's your attendance question for today. And that's all that I've got for you today. And I'm happy to take questions. Go ahead.
I think that you got the wrong link.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, it's the wrong one.
Thank you for that. And it's on the screen, but I will put up the right link. Muscle memory. There's the right link, and there's the question. Thanks for that. Any other questions?
Thank you so much. Have a really happy Thanksgiving.
You too. Have a nice Thanksgiving.
Thanks, Professor.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Happy Thanksgiving, Professor. I'll see you later.
See you. You too.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. I will go ahead and end the meeting.